Hey, do you guys want more nerd stuff, more deep dives on technique, more deep dives on physiology, biomechanics, exercise analysis, lots more Q&A, and a bunch of insider videos of me training myself, and there's lots of silence around and you get to see all my sets? Cool. Well, then hit the button below to join our members community. And you know what? There's a special prize. I'm just kidding. We don't have a special prize, but I'll see you in the members community. Hey folks, Dr. Mike here for Renaissance Periodization. Today's ultra nerdy, super nerdy, pocket protector, glasses wearing, getting punched in the face in the schoolyard type nerdy topic is EMG, electromyography, and hypertrophy, and the specific question of what can EMG studies, which are very often cited, tell us about what muscle growth is or is not going on. So, EMG is used very often in research in exercise science and sports science in general, and very often in hypertrophy research. EMG stands for electromyography. It is technically the measurement of some of the electrical activity of muscles, the motor nerve, the sort of neuron designed to tell the muscle to contract, does so by releasing some chemicals, and then these chemicals bond to the muscle itself or to the surface of the muscle, and that starts an electrical cascade which wraps around the whole muscle and actually penetrates in some cases deep into the muscle. And that electrical cascade is something that we can measure to some extent, a decent extent, though not perfect, with electromyography, right? And that electrical cascade doesn't itself contract the muscle, but it has a few other things happen afterwards that result in muscle contraction. So as you can tell already, there's a bit of a difference between electrical activity and actual muscle contraction. And some of that is where the nuance happens, where we have to say, well, if an EMG study says this, that doesn't exactly mean muscle contraction, because sometimes people say it's one and the other. However, EMG is a pretty decent proxy on average of muscle contraction, but not all the time. So, because EMG is some kind of proxy, some attempt at measurement of muscle activity, it has often been used to infer hypertrophic outcome differences that would result if you continue to train in, let's say, two different ways. One of them gets you very high EMG readings, one of them gets you lower. The proposition there is that the higher EMG readings would cause more hypertrophy in the long run because ostensibly the higher EMG readings reflect more muscle contraction, and muscle contraction over time generates tension and propels or stimulates rather muscle growth. So far, most of that is roughly true. And the way we use that is in a couple of different ways in the research literature. First, people can compare things like pre and post exhaust. Do my pec flies first, then I do bench, or I do bench first, then pec flies. See which one of those orders gets you better electrical activity as measured by EMG. And then you say, well, whichever one does grows more muscle. May or may not be true, but we'll get to that in a bit. Another thing people like to use EMG for is to figure out the difference between exercise variations, like a sumo squat versus a regular squat, seeing which one, activates the glutes more seemingly or activates the quads more, and thus making inferences on which one you should do to grow the glutes or quads, pretty common. Another one is different loading paradigms. You take the same exercise, have some people do sets of 5, have other people do sets of 20, see how the EMG results are affected, and you say, well, it seems that the heavier loading affects the EMG better, and thus heavier loading maybe promotes more muscle contraction and maybe more growth. That's something that people speculate on. A lot of times it's between different exercises. A pretty common approach is taking something like squats and pairing it with something, or pairing it oppositionally against something like hip thrusts, trying to see EMG activity and trying to figure out which one grows the glutes more. And then another one that's very common lately is ranges of motion within the same exercise. So you have EMG, you have, let's say, a bench press. One group does here to here, lockout type of reps. One group does partial reps from the lower end range, and you see which one has the higher EMG values, and you try to infer which one is going to grow more muscle, right? And a whole bunch of different ones, different study designs that are roughly pointing at kind of similar stuff. And this is a fine way to use EMG as long as you know about the potential limitations. And that's what this video is about, the potential limitations of using EMG. And there are at least 10 of them. This is not an inclusive list, but it's close. So here we go. What are the potential differences between what we want to assume that EMG equals hypertrophy or infers hypertrophy very exactly, or the alternate idea that EMG may be not inferring hypertrophy at all or only to a very small and highly error-prone extent. So first limitation is that electrode position relative to the muscle on the surface of the skin can make it seem that one exercise or one way of doing an exercise or part of the range of motion of an exercise is really, really good at generating tension through EMG, but the reality is that the EMG just picks up certain range of motion better than another. Easy example is this. If you put a bunch of EMG leads at the very top of the lat, for example, an exercise in which the lat is stretched and you come down to here is going to have a lot of EMG activity, whereas an exercise that goes from here to here might have a similar amount of activity because the lat's still involved. On the other hand, if you put EMG leads lower, if the lat activity, if the exercise is down here with the lat, you're going to get a lot of EMG activity. But up here, the lat stretches out, and a lot of the lat stretching occurs under the skin. It's not paired exactly to the skin. EMG leads stay at the same point in the skin, but the lat muscle moves away from where the leads are. So it can look like this is not a very good lat exercise, but the real problem was that the EMG leads were placed lower and thus inherently biased that the shorter range of motion or the lower range of motion down here seems to be more muscle activity generating and thus more hypertrophic. So if you interpret a study like this without being very careful where you place your EMG leads, which actually happens in studies way more often than you would hope for, then all of a sudden you conclude, hey, lat pull downs from here to here as opposed to here are better for hypertrophy, where maybe the opposite is the case. So that's a big problem. Next one, probably a very small problem, but nonetheless something we have to be keen on, is that EMG, as done in most research facilities, is what's called surface EMG. You place leads that are not penetrating the skin. They have tape around them or sticky substance. You just place them directly onto the muscle, but it's not really the muscle because it's the skin. And they are very good at detecting electrical activity of the muscle just deep to the skin. But they're much better at detecting activity of a muscle that is superficial versus deep. So, for example, your quad can be fucking enormous. And there's all kinds of muscles deep to your quad and the adductors and stuff like that. And if you place EMG leads on your quad, especially for subjects that have a relatively high body fat, a lot of females store lots of body fat in their quads, for example, you can compare two different ways of squatting or something like that and say, well, gee, this one has way higher EMG activity. What you might be looking at is actually the deep musculature was way more active in one position or one exercise, and the surface musculature was more active in another position or another exercise. And because we only have a very biased look at the surface, automatically the deep activity could be the same amount of muscle activity and could lead to the same growth. But we're saying, this exercise variation sucks because it didn't have the EMG readings. And it's not because it actually sucked. It's because our EMG is much better at reading on the surface than it is deep. Now, I'm over-exaggerating a little bit, because it's not much better, but there is a difference. If you want to really look into what's going on, there's a variety of approaches you can take. One of them is called fine wire EMG. Get ready. If you're queasy, just mute this for a while. You take a really fine wire that looks a lot like a needle, and you stick it into the muscle as deep as you want, and you can stick it at a bunch of different depths. It kind of looks like acupuncture, I guess. And then the person does the curls or the extensions or whatever, and then you actually see what's going on deep inside the muscle. And sometimes that's marginally different enough than surface electromyography that the results aren't exactly what you thought they would be. And that's just something we have to keep our eyes on. It's not a huge thing. It's a very small thing. And there are other elements in this list that are much more pronounced in their difference, but something we have to be at least intellectually aware of. Next is an enormous, huge thing that renders a lot of EMG interpretation and inference to hypertrophy as like, gee, really troublesome. And here it is. Generally speaking, electromyography, biases, higher readings, we get a higher, seemingly higher muscle activity and oftentimes actual muscle activity. The highest is usually in isometric contraction. So if you have a bench bar that's just fixed in place and you go, and you push on it as hard as possible, EMG readings are amazing. The next highest, one lower, is concentric. So if you push a bench press like this, they have EMG readings. Usually you don't get as high of EMG readings in the concentric as you do in an isometric. So someone can say, okay, there's less muscle activity here. I'll get to the point in a sec. The lowest EMG readings are typically in the eccentric phase, lowering the bench press. We could be tempted to conclude that from those readings alone, highest EMG readings at isometric, second highest at concentric, lowest at eccentric, would give us the thought that, well, gee, that means the isometric grows the most muscle, concentric the second most, and eccentric dead last. The reality is actually completely backwards, making this probably one of the bigger whopper points of this presentation. It turns out, by a small margin at least, eccentrically biased stimuli are probably the most muscle growing, concentric is in second place, and isometric is in last place on average. Right? By a small margin, all of them are good for growth. But if we just interpret EMG readings at face value, we can literally conclude the opposite of what is true. And that is not good. Now, it's very, very easy when you're doing the same exercise and doing the eccentric analysis, concentric analysis, isometric analysis. If you're familiar with this literature, you can at least say, well, I know what I'm looking at, and I know that they're going to have higher EMG readings than is really inferring of hypertrophy. That's okay. But the big problem comes when you, let's say, examine two different kinds of exercises. Let's say a hack squat with a pause, and then a leg press with no pause, and say which one of these grows more muscle. Well, one of them may have a more pronounced eccentric phase. One of them may have a more pronounced concentric phase. One of them, this is very easy, especially with a pause, may have a more pronounced isometric phase. And then because those phases map onto EMGs a lot better than they map onto hypertrophy, or actually they map onto hypertrophy completely the opposite, what you can do is say, well, the average EMG amplitude of the leg press in this condition was higher, so that means that hack squats won't grow as much muscle. But that might be because hack squats, in the way you set up the exercise and the way you cued the technique, have more of an eccentric component than the leg press, have a slightly less concentric component, and considerably less isometric component. That probably, just on muscle growth theory, based on what we know about these different contraction types, will make the hack squat more muscle growing than the leg press as you're doing it. But the way you read it just off of EMG, you concluded the very opposite result. And it's complicated. Different phases and activations in different exercises are so complex that when we look at an EMG and we see one EMG is higher than the other, overhead tricep extensions beat regular skull crushers or something, we have to ask, well, is it different phases? Well, and also, is it surface versus deep? Is it electrode position? We have a bunch of questions to ask now. So as you can tell, the idea that EMG equals a very good proxy of hypertrophy is starting to really slip away from us. But there's more. But there's a lot more. Point number 4. Long versus short muscle lengths. It seems pretty reliable in the literature that EMG activity from here to here is higher on average with the same load, same relative effort, same everything than it is from here to here. Okay, longer muscle lengths, you tend to have lower EMG activities than you do at shorter muscle lengths. But growth usually seems to occur better at longer muscle lengths than shorter. So it's backwards again. So now when you have one exercise or one range of motion showing better EMG values, you have to ask yourself the question, well, hold up, let's look at the muscle lengths, at least on the surface, to see if we've made an egregious error, right? So if we just don't do this, we only read the EMGs and we find studies and say, well, hey, the EMG here is lower, so that's stupid, then we end up concluding things that are actually backwards. A very classic example of this is if we study like the lat prayer or the pullover, right, for lats, the EMG activity from here to here is really good. The EMG activity from here to here is not so good. So people are tempted to say, well, gee, why would you even do this part if the muscle's not nearly as active? Well, hold on a second. We already know that at longer muscle lengths, the muscle is, the EMG readings don't correspond to the tension produced by the muscle nearly as much. We also know that's the more hypertrophic region. So if we say, well, gee, the EMG readings say that this range of motion for pullovers or lat prayers is better than this one, we could be inferring the opposite of the truth. We have to be very, very, very careful. Another limitation is active versus passive force detection. So if you have active force, that means the muscle itself is generating tension, and the EMG is really pretty good at detecting that because the electrical activity of the muscle is, and the EMG senses that. However, let's say you do a deep bench press and at the bottom, you relax your pecs somewhat so the EMG readings won't be high, but the force is still being imparted and your pecs are actually being pulled apart by heavy resistance. that generation of tension, your muscles are still feeling a fuck ton of tension, but the tension isn't coming as much from their own contraction attempt. It's coming from gravity and barbell pulling them apart, and they have to generate tension to resist. This is called passive tension, and it generates a crap load of hypertrophy that you will completely miss, or almost completely miss, with EMG analysis. So exercises that have a big passive tension component, one of which is, let's say, you're squatting super deep and you're taking a 1 second pause. During that 1 second pause, if you let your quads turn off or turn down, it's going to look like, gee, that bottom sucks. Why would you even go that low? Your muscle activity really drops off. But the actual tension experienced by the muscle fibers is fucking enormous and causes a shitload of hypertrophy. It's actually the most tension the muscles experience the entire time. They're just not generating themselves. It's being generated for them passively. So we don't want to say EMG maps exactly onto hypertrophy, because we could be missing passive versus active force detection. We catch all the active, we miss a bunch of the passive. Passive matters. It's a big deal, and we don't want to miss it. Number 6. This is a crazy one, and it's really a trip. So EMG notoriously favors heavier loading. So if you have the same exercise, you do a set of 5 with it, let's say to failure or very close, the overall EMG amplitude is going to be really high. Like, holy shit, your muscles are really working. If you do a set of 20 with the same exercise, normalized to the number of reps, et cetera, normalized to the total stimulus, the EMG won't be as impressive. So we can be tempted to say, well, look, the EMG of heavy loading is better than the EMG of light loading, thus heavy loading causes more growth. We would be tempted to do so. We would be tempted to say so and think so. However, we've already done the long-term studies, the direct studies that literally show actual hypertrophy. We measure actual muscle size with DEXA and all these other measurements. And we know for pretty damn near fact at this point, very high degree of certainty, that anything between roughly your 5 RM and roughly your 30 RM causes a really similar amount of growth, maybe an equivalent amount of growth. In some cases, higher reps actually cause more growth. In some cases, lower reps cause more growth. But if we just went off EMG alone, heavier loading automatically biases us to think the EMG, well, really, heavier loading is really good. But we could be tempted to conclude that higher repetitions or lighter loads, or even exercises that the repetitions are the same, but the amplitude of the exercise is higher. For example, you move a longer distance, one exercise versus another, and it ends up being that the total time spent generating tension of one exercise is higher, the other exercise is lower. And because of that, the adjusted, if you go for 20 or 10 RMs on both, the 10 RM on both isn't actually the same relative load to both. The shorter exercise, shorter amplitude is a much higher relative load, and the longer exercise is much more distance, so that it is 10 reps, but it's the same amount of contraction as the other exercise would experience with like 15 reps. And thus, the exercise that has a longer range of motion, we say, well, per rep, the EMG amplitude's not as high as this one. Other exercise that has a lower one, so maybe it's not as much growth. But oftentimes, exercises that generate the most range of motion, not always, but often, generate more growth. So again, this would bring us to think at least 2 things. 1, heavier loads are superior, which they're probably not. And 2, exercises which take a longer time to do per rep and thus per set are not as hypertrophic as they really are in reality. So again, if we started trying to put a pinch of salt to muddy the waters, we're now pouring all kinds of fucking, what do we just put in their brew? Dragon eyes, testicles of eagle testicles. Do eagles have testicles? I don't know. They have a cloaca, I know that. All right. Not looking good for EMG so far, but don't worry, we'll try to save it at the end. Fatigue. Fatigue's a big one. So EMG picks up neural fatigue pretty well, nervous system fatigue pretty well. It doesn't pick up metabolic fatigue all that well because it doesn't measure the metabolism. It measures muscle contraction. It measures muscle electrical activity, which if you have a high level of metabolic fatigue, you could have the same amount of muscle electrical activity as always, but a higher amount of growth per rep because we know metabolites grow muscle, but that's not picked up by the EMG often, right? So you can have 2 situations, just to show you a hypothetical example of how this can work. If you have a low EMG amplitude and you don't have a ton of metabolites, right, you could expect low growth, and actually low growth would occur. But if you have low EMG, For example, the last 5 reps of a 30 rep set, EMG is not very impressive because your nervous system is tired, and there's excitation, contraction, uncoupling, like that little boundary between the nerve and the muscle where the neurotransmitters are supposed to go through has all kinds of crap in it that came out of this damaged and tired muscle. And now the muscle contraction isn't stimulated, some fraction of the time that it's supposed to be. The nerve is like, fire, fire, fire. And the muscle's like, God, get out of my face. I'm super tired. I have gunk everywhere. I can't even hear you. So what ends up happening is in that condition, you have the same low EMG amplitude as in the first. But if you have a high degree of metabolites in the muscle, you actually get some pretty decent growth. But in both conditions, because if we're going just off of EMG, we can think, it's both low growth conditions. So in this case, we have ruled out high growth where actually it occurs because of metabolites, but EMG doesn't really pick up metabolites, at least not reliably, at least not directly. So low EMG does not lead to low growth in all cases, specifically those regarding metabolites, specifically in high repetition sort of situations. So more muddying of the waters. Point number 8. This is a big one, and this is something that we have to, as scientifically minded people, keep in mind. I could have said that better. So extrapolating from one muscle to another is super common. People will say they'll have an EMG study that shows like, hey, doing a partial range of motion in this exercise has higher EMG amplitude than doing a full range of motion or the other way around. And thus you should do it like this. And, you're going in, you're going to go do squats. And someone's like, you shouldn't do them like that. You should do them like this because of this EMG study. You go pull it up on your phone and it says, in triceps brachii. And you're like, this is a study on triceps. And they're like, okay. Like, I'm doing my quads. They're like, okay, but it's a muscle. Like, right. So there's a chance that's just general muscle physiology that's been found out and it works across all muscles. That's very possible. But it's also possible that this is a specific nuance of the triceps or of other muscles more similar to it and does not apply to the quadriceps or to the hamstrings or to the calves or to whatever it is that you're doing. And this asshole's trying to feed you EMG data. Stop doing that. Do this. So it is an uncertainty that we have to understand. So if we want to take EMG studies and we want to conclude from them, here's how we change our training, we had better be very careful about not crossing from one muscle to the other with full confidence. So if we have research that says, hey, for the biceps, the EMG stuff says this works, can you use it for the forearms or for the triceps or for the quads or for the glutes? You can. Absolutely you can. You can infer that this way of training that the EMG found was better might be better than this other way of training they found worse. But that might takes a probability cutoff that's pretty fucking decent. So you shouldn't be coming up to people and saying, hey, don't do this, do that. And then when they say, but this is a different muscle, you're going to have like basically caught with your dick in your hand. You want to be like, well, hey, like from other research on other muscles, we've shown this is the case. So my best guess is that this will also be the case here. But if they try it, it doesn't seem to be working and they don't get a sore as pumped or whatever, then you should be like, oh, okay, that makes sense because we were inferring from one muscle to another. And that's not always possible, right? So few EMG studies for now. And so many muscles are so much easier to study than others that a lot of times you have like 10 quad EMG studies, 15 bicep studies, 3 tricep, 1 lat, and that's it. Nobody ever EMGs the important muscle. Electrodes, where. Or do you? Am I talking about number 1 end or the number 2 end? That's for you to figure out at home. In any case, number 9, single study limitations. A lot of times, one EMG study will come out saying the lats, it's better train lats like this and like that. So that one study has every single thing I said so far as a limitation, including the fact that it's just one study. Like in the real world, EMG studies especially are easy to fuck up. There's this thing called crosstalk, where if you have EMG leads and the cables come close to each other or the 2 leads are too close, then one lead picks up electrical activity from this and also from the lead and also from the electrically, let's say you have some kind of machine there that has an electrical plug in it that could also pick up on that. It's crazy, right? So EMG, you would think, put this lead on and it gives you exactly the electrical activity with no error. That's not even remotely close. If you're very careful, you can do a great job. But in the real world, one study at a time, a lot of times the primary researcher who's on the publication or whose first name on the publication or the last, he's not actually doing the study or she's not actually around much of the time, just some of the time. What you have is, bright undergraduates and graduate students doing the actual study. And they can fuck shit up. I've seen it happen myself when I was in this environment. So does that mean that all studies are bullshit and the grad students are just making up numbers? Fuck no. Most of them are pretty good. But pretty good doesn't mean perfect. So a single study, if it says this versus that, it's probably not a good idea to take your entire training program and upend it because a single study said the lats don't do this, they do that through EMG. Never mind the fact that there's 8 other fucking reasons to be skeptical of not cynical, skeptical of the EMG. But now this is another one where you think, okay, one study, if a couple more studies come out, I'll be more likely to change my training than if it was just one study. Because one study can say all kinds of weird shit. I just wouldn't, nothing to hang your hat on. Well, do people really hang their hats on stuff anymore? Back in the 50s, you used to show up to someone's house and you're like, "Meh, see?" And they're like, "Meh." And you had a hat and you had a suit. And they'd be like, "Meh, hang your hat. Here, see?" And you're like, "Meh, meh." Like that. Does that even happen? I don't know. I guess people in suits don't really come over to your house much anymore unless the feds want to talk to you. Do they even wear hats? Shit. All right. 10. Our last limitation that at least I could think of in the whatever amount of time it took me to make this presentation. This is a real big problem. As far as I know, as of the filming of this video, there may be as few as 0 studies that have actually taken EMG readings at the beginning. EMG readings maybe a couple times during the study over the course of 8 to 12 weeks and seen how the EMG analysis, because EMG is going to say, well, this way of doing triceps is better. This way is worse because EMG here is low, EMG here is high. Take that. Same subject, same study, and actually measure muscle growth over 8 to 12 weeks and see who wins. Because you would think, well, EMG is a proxy for muscle growth, but that it is a proxy for muscle growth has never been formally tested. There is at least one study out now that did the same thing with the pump. Right? They tested who got the biggest pumps from a given level of volume of all the subjects at the beginning of the study, and then they just trained them and saw who got more jacked. Surprise, the people that got the best pumps got the most jacked. So pump is now, at least with one study, not so convincing, but a good place to start, a somewhat marginally validated instrument by which to infer hypertrophy, a validated proxy. Not very well validated, but I got something. EMG, I'm not aware of any studies that have correlated EMG outcomes with actual hypertrophy in the same study. So like, gee whiz, that's kind of a problem. And just one study wouldn't be overly convincing. So if one of these studies come out, we could at least be like, oh, wow, it's good. It's a 70% accurate proxy for that muscle, for those 2 exercises, for that group of individuals. We need a few more studies to really become confident in the fact that it's a good proxy. Currently, I think we have 0, and maybe I missed it. But even if we have 1 or 2, we can do better. And if we're really going to be saying and reading EMG literature as if it's like, hey, this is what hypertrophy means, we want more than 0 and more than 1 or 2 studies, right? So that's the last limitation. Putting that all together, what is sort of my verdict, at least personally, on using EMG? Here it is. EMG is one tool by which we could predict and proxy muscle growth. And here's the thing. It's not a guarantee of what's going on. It's a hint at what might be going on and should be the basis, one of the bases for trying things in the gym. You read an EMG study and you go, oh, interesting. I never thought of doing lat pull downs like that. I'll try it. And then you try it and you see, does the stimulus to fatigue ratio work out? Like, do you get better tension in your lats with this? Are your lats burning more? Are you getting better lat pumps? Do your lats seem more disrupted, more sore, more tired, etc.? And how are your joints feeling? If the EMG says do it like this, it's correct, and it turns out it is, fuck yeah, awesome. But if you try it and really diligently try it out, and you're like, this is backwards. This thing is fucking stupid. The EMG must not have said the right thing. Well, fuck, man, you got 10 really good ass reasons why the EMG could have been wrong. So don't worry about being like, well, but this EMG study, how am I going to hashtag science? How am I going to, hashtag be evidence-based if I'm ignoring EMG literature? Not ignoring it. You're integrating it, understanding that it could be a hint at what's going on, but is like 50,000 light years away from being exactly what is going on as the perfect proxy, right? EMG studies are not the last word. They're not like hashtag fuck yeah science. They're just a hint. And if you use them intelligently like that with a great bit of skepticism, you're actually hashtag evidence-based. And then, I don't know what happens next. I guess if you put shit on Instagram, hashtag evidence-based, you wait for 30 minutes, check your DMs, and these evidence-based nerd girls just come out of fucking woodwork and they're like, hey, oh my God, I heard you're evidence-based. Ah! And you're like, will you go on a date with me? And they're like, of course, but you've got to cite publications during the date. And you're like, fuck, I had to study for a date. I love it. I can't wait. Just talk about literature into the hours of the night, passionate sex. You guys know the rest. That's real life. So here's the thing. That was cool. That was a lot of learning. However, there's always more learning to be done. 4 ways that you can learn much more. I'm not actually an expert on EMG, but we have lots of experts on EMG, and one of them, maybe the preeminent expert on skepticism towards EMGs, and a very, very amazing biomechanist in his own right, Andrew Vygotsky. He's like a professor and everything. He's the real deal. I'm just some guy on YouTube, and here is how you can access some of his work. He has been interviewed by Omar and Eric on the Iron Culture podcast, which is a fucking great podcast. You should just subscribe to it anyway. His video is specifically linked in the description below. Andrew has talked about EMG in another video, an earlier video, which I've also linked for you guys. And he's written 2 papers with a few collaborators on skepticism of EMG and hypertrophy linked together. And I've linked both of those papers for you in the description. So yeah, go ahead and read that shit. It gets a little complicated because Andrew's smart as fuck. But, if some of this wasn't super convincing, or it was, but you want to learn more and get in the nuance, that's the place to do it. Folks, thank you so much. If I bored you to tears, wipe those tears away, hashtag evidence-based in your Instagram, and go on a crazy evidence-based date. Hey, you kids have fun. I'll see you later.